But let's start with the federal election. Of course, it's still 9 days away, but early voting has already started and the early results are quite remarkable. Exit polling conducted by the Daily Telegraph, who interviewed 4,000 people across 19 regional seats as they left polling booths, found the government's primary vote has increased by 4.6%. Now, that's remarkable when you consider that typically it's Conservatives who vote early. You'll see there the Coalition's vote has increased by 2.8%. But here's the really fascinating part. Have a look there at One Nation. Their vote is just 2.5%. That's their primary vote, 50% down on what it was at the last election. Now, here's the bit I want to understand. Maybe Liz and Joe can help me. The latest news poll had One Nation polling at 7%, and yet exit polling shows them at just 2.5%. That's a massive discrepancy. So, Liz and Joe, what's going on? How do you explain that?
I'm glad you asked. I have come up with a new electoral phenomenon. It's copyrighted, so don't try to steal it. You heard it here first. Like we had the shy Trump voter in the US, I think we have the shy One Nation voter in Australia. And there's a couple of interesting things about this poll. One is that, as you say, usually early polling in the old days used to favour Conservatives. And that was because it was often older people who wanted to do it, and they tend to skew Conservative. They don't want to be lining up in the heat and the sun all day and night. So they get out and do it. And so that is maybe even why you've seen a bit of a jump in the Coalition's primary vote as well. But of course, we're seeing a much, much bigger jump in the Labor vote. Now, you cannot take any of this hugely serious. It's really interesting, but it's really, really rough. So these are people who have already made up their minds. So by definition, they've so made up their minds, they're not even interested in what the next week and a half happens. You know, someone could be shot dead in the main street. Someone could turn out to be Zorro or Jack the Ripper. They wouldn't care, right? They're voting for...
They're rusted on voters.
So they're rusted on. So that tends to favour the major parties. So you're seeing here massive dip in the number of people who are voting for others, so tiny minor parties and independents. Greens stay about the same because those voters are pretty rusted on as well. But like you say, the thing that really jumped out at me was this tiny little One Nation vote. And I think another thing that's going on is that exit polls are the only polls now. I don't think even Roy Morgan does face-to-face anymore. They are the only polls where the pollster actually asks you how you're going to vote, or indeed how you actually voted face-to-face. So you are looking another human being in an eye. And I think that skews it massively towards more progressive parties, because I think people will sort of virtue signalling and they don't want to feel like they're just voting for the tax cut or whatever they can get in their pocket or whatever, or to keep the immigrants out or whatever. But especially with a party like, and again, this came up again and again and again, and it was controversial and it's been disputed, but it looks pretty obvious that it was there. This idea that people were telling pollsters, oh no, I'm not voting for Donald Trump, and then away they would go and go, and I think people are doing it right there, because as you say, One Nation was at 5% last time around. That's double what they've come up here. And since then, we've seen a jump in news poll just a week ago of another 2%, so 7%. So I think there is a shy One Nation voter out there. And I think when it comes to the independents and the other tiny parties, what you're seeing is people who are thinking, maybe I will actually ditch both of them and go to someone new. They're the sort of people you would think are very sort of what you might call high information, or people who are very engaged with the process. They're going to wait it out until polling day, and that's when they'll put it down. So there you go.
What do you think, Lizzie, buying that? Shy One Nation voters?
Yeah, isn't that interesting, though, that the society is such at the moment that you wouldn't just stare down barrel and tell the exit poller, One Nation all the way, baby. They're the ones who represent my views. If you are correct, Joe, that's what we're essentially saying. People are like, oh, much like the shy Trump voters, they're just like, well, actually, I'm not going to say that. That will get me publicly disparaged. But given I'm talking to someone in person, I'm just going to tell a furphy. That's basically what we're saying here. But I think it's remarkable that 1 in 25 Australians, that basically means 1 million people have already voted within 48 hours of early polling. I think that reflects the mood of the nation, really. People just want to get this over and done with. As we said when the campaign was finally, it's officially happening, we felt like it had been going for months already. I think people just want to get to early polling. Goodness knows how many votes will be left to cast by the time we actually have polling day if we keep up this rate.
So that is another really, really good point. And I'm sorry, I just had my head in this like for weeks now that it's actually happening. So the AEC, the Australian Electoral Commission itself, said we expect to have about a third of people vote early, which would be in itself a record. The Australian National University said actually we think it could be up to a half. Sources I've spoken to in the Labor Party say it will be more than a half. So by the time we actually get to polling day, more than half of Australian voters will have already voted before the poll.
Help me understand the history here, because I think prior to 2010, you had to provide a written reason for voting early. Why was that?
Kind of COVID. I've called it the civic equivalent of working from home. So clearly what has happened is people have realised that they don't actually have to line up on polling day. They can vote early. They can go away for the weekend. They don't need to be anywhere or whatever. And then COVID, of course, happened, and so people were encouraged. Even though our election didn't quite coincide with lockdowns, Scott Morrison got elected just before it hit, and then Anthony Albanese got elected just as the restrictions were being eased. But there was still that idea, like with working from home, that if you can avoid crowds, it's probably.
But that's a convenience, right? But in terms of a healthy democracy, wouldn't it be better to prevent early polling so that people listen to both sides, listen to all they have to say, and then we vote as a country rather than in dribs and drabs over 2 weeks with many people not having heard the arguments?
Well, it means that the parties who are fully aware of when early voting happens need to roll out their policies sooner, especially things as huge as, an extra $21 billion on national security, on defence. I mean, that could have been, who knows, not quite a game changer, but it could have made a dent had they announced that 2 weeks prior. But it has fried my brain how late both of the major parties have announced some of their most major policies that they're taking to the election, when in fact the election has already begun.
That's right. And also, and again, just to go full nerd, just to get my geek on, it means that the amount of votes that Peter Dutton needs to win increases exponentially as it gets closer and closer to polling day. So, for example, if he's got people voting early when he's down 48-52, even if he has a miracle turnaround and he's ahead 52-48 in the last week, that's not enough to get him over the line, because he's got to scramble and get back all the votes that he's already lost, or rather overcompensate for all the votes he's already lost. And that is very hard to do. And we also have this thing we're doing at News Corp where we do this thing called Voter Verdict, where we have a kind of tracking group of undecided voters, and these are actually undecided voters.
Right.
And this week it was very, very interesting. There was 0.1 between them. So we get them to each rank.
Wow.
We get them to each rank the leader's performance over the past week out of 10. And it was, I won't say who won, but it was very low scores, like 6 to 5.9 was the result. So it's very much a pox on both your houses. And so that tells me that these early results, which favour the two major parties, we're actually going to see a blowout to groups like One Nation, the Teals, Independents. And
we want to move on, but I've just got one more quick question on this topic.
Yes.
That might be of interest to people. The huge number of early votes, does that mean a result will be known quicker on election night?
No, because no matter what happens, I call it's like Schrodinger's cat, the thought experiment where there's a cat in a box but you can't see it, so you don't know if it's alive or dead. And so the cat is both alive and dead as far as anyone knows until you open the box and the
results makes no difference to getting a result.
No, that's right. So you cannot start counting votes, no matter what, until 6 p.m. on polling day. And so that's when it all comes out. The fact that there are so many pre-polls means they'll probably be counted faster, because they can all be gathered into the one spot and be ready to go as soon as you hit 6 o'clock. So it's good because you get an earlier result. But no, you can't do anything. So there's no way to know how the result's going and then try to counter against it.